Okay? What are the three key components? Axon, soma, dendrite. What does the axon do? Okay, sends messages where? Okay, good. Sends messages to other neurons. What does the soma do? Keeps it alive. And dendrites? Okay, they receive communication. Good. So how does a neuron communicate with another neuron? What? Neurotransmitters, right? Neurotransmitters. How neurons communicate with one another. What about within a neuron? How does a message travel? All right, electrically. So within a neuron, it's electric. Between neurons, it is chemical, right? That chemical is a neurotransmitter. Good. We started talking a little bit about how we peek inside the brain, right? How do we peek inside the brain? What are some of the things we can do? Not quite there yet. First thing? Clinical studies that we talked about? Deep lesioning. What is deep lesioning? Now what is it? What?
They do it to rats.
Okay. Do it to rats? What is it that they do?
They like insert like a really tiny needle into
Okay.
Don't they destroy a part of the brain and see what happens?
Okay, good. So they're going to destroy a part of the brain and see what happens. So what are we going to compare here if we were to engage in this deep lesioning? What do we compare to get an idea of what has just happened to this rat?
compare a normal rat to a brain damaged rat.
Okay, compare a normal rat to a brain damaged rat. Or better yet, look at what this rat was doing prior to the deep lesioning that they can no longer do now, right? So this sort of pre and post comparison. So why do this? What is it going to tell us?
What functions and activities like are specific to different areas of the brain.
Okay, good. So get an idea of some of the things that are happening here in that particular area of the brain. We started talking about human brain damage and how we can look at sort of case study issues. So somebody who's had a traumatic event, we can look at what it was that they were able to do prior to the tragic event, and then what has happened to them subsequently, right? To get an idea of where this person's damage lies as a clue to or cue to what that area of the brain was involved in. Okay, so some of the other approaches that we could look at. The electrical stimulation of the brain. What they'll do is they'll pass a very mild electrical current through. And what that current will do is cause neurons to react. So that electrical current is going to cause neurons to react as if they had received some type of message from another neuron, right? And cause them to fire. So why do this? Why do this? What are we going to do here? The same sorts of things. Why do this? Yeah. Okay. Or better yet, see what happens when you stimulate them. Yes.
I was going to say like the example of putting your hand on like a burner, how it will send a neuron to fire so that some pain can reach.
Okay. Let me clarify. This isn't going to hurt you. All right. This current isn't strong enough that it's not. We're not like doing like the electrical therapy type stuff.
Messages for whenever you put your hand on something, say for example, and it sends a message back to your brain that says, oh, you need to move this.
Okay, no. So here what we're talking about, the different ways that we can sort of peek inside of the brain to see how the brain sort of works.
Isn't it the same thing as electroshock therapy?
No, electroshock therapy is like a very intense. This is much milder. So essentially, with something like this, what they would do to get a better idea of what's going on with particular neurons is stimulate a small section of the brain to sort of fire, right? Encourage those neurons to fire, to get an idea of what their function is. So they fire as if they had received a message. You with me? All right, so deep brain stimulation is a little different. They're going to take electrodes and embed them very deep in particular areas of the brain. And what they'll do is they'll route it to a pacemaker. So a surgically implanted device under the collarbone that is going to sort of affect the stimulation in that particular area of the brain. Remember, all of these sort of techniques that we're talking about are different ways that we can sort of look inside the brain to see what is happening with people under certain situations. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, typically what's done here is they'll take magnetic pulses and apply it to the cortex. We'll talk about a lot of the brain parts today, that outer layer, using special copper coils that are positioned over the head. Again, basic idea is to give some type of stimulation to the brain. Transcranial direct current stimulation, scalp electrodes are placed on and they pass very low amplitude currents to the brain. Again, as if they had been stimulated to fire. And what happens, you can get a sort of subsequent idea of everything that is going on in that particular area. It's like an EEG. If you've ever seen an EEG, what they're doing is they are simply measuring the electrical activity that is occurring on the surface of the brain at that particular moment in time. So you may see like sleep patterns, right? What's a sleep pattern going to look like here? When somebody's awake and active, it's very short and erratic. What about when someone's in a very deep stage of sleep? You don't see that sort of erratic behavior. Right? What they're measuring is simply the electrical activity occurring on the brain at that particular moment. CT scans, right? Brain imaging method, they're simply taking x-rays of the brain to get an idea of some of the underlying structures of the brain. So again, all of these different techniques, they're trying to get an idea of what it is that the brain does, or what particular structures of the brain will do, or to take a look and see what is active for a particular person at a given moment in time. So MRIs, somebody was just talking about, brain imaging method, they're going to use radio waves. So they send radio waves in, magnetic fields, to give this detailed image of the brain. So you're going to get a very nice, clear, detailed image of what the brain is doing at that moment in time. CAT scans, the CT scans, don't show a great deal of detail. You can kind of get an overall picture. So if they wanted much more detail about what is happening in the brain, MRIs are what they're going to use. And an fMRI, a functional MRI, it takes a sort of movie. So it's going to track changes in progress in the brain. What it really does is it looks to see how oxygen is being used in the brain. So as people are engaging in certain tasks, what parts of the brain become activated as they progress through the sequence of tasks. Right? So all they're doing is sort of tracking, measuring what parts of the brain become active at different times. PET scan, positive emission tomography, brain image method, they're going to use radioactive sugar. Right? So radioactive sugar is injected into the person, and a computer is going to give you this sort of color-coded image of the brain. Lighter colors indicate more activity. So again, if you were to use this, somebody would perform a particular task, and you would look to see what part of the brain is becoming activated while someone is engaged in this particular task. So maybe they're reading something, right? Or listening to something, or engaging in speech production. And you can see what parts of the brain become activated as they engage in those different tasks. You with me? So we're just trying to get a sort of peek inside the brain to get an idea of what is going on in these different areas. So here's a CT scan of a 5-year-old girl with a head injury. She has a skull fracture. Right? So again, CT, you don't get a lot of detail here. You're kind of getting an overall picture. But can you see how they would find this sort of traction here, right? So trying to look at head injury to see if there's some negative things going on here for this particular kid. And here we can clearly see that there's a fracture in the kid's skull. The image of 211A, this one down here, it didn't show up. This is not an EEG like this says. What is this? All right, this is going to be the PET scan, right? The EEG would look more like what? Just looking at the electrical activity of the brain, okay? These are simply looking at what part of the brain is becoming activated where. And then fMRI, you could look at changes in the sort of movie-like sequence for where different areas of the brain become activated, all right? So simply looking into sort of what is happening in the minds of people, what's happening in people's brains as they engage in very specific tasks. When you think about how it is that we would be able to uncover what sections of their brain are involved in different activities, this is a very good way to do it, right? we found out that speech production is different than like auditory comprehension of things. Figuring out where the brain becomes activated allows people to understand the sort of intricacies of how the brain works. All right, so looking at parts of the brain, we'll start talking now about some of the structures of the brain itself. The medulla, we'll show pictures, but we'll describe it first. The medulla is that first large swelling that sits at the top of the spinal cord. It's really the lowest part of the brain. So it's connecting the brain to the spinal cord. And I mentioned this the other day. It is responsible for a lot of the life-sustaining functions that we engage in. Things like breathing, swallowing, and heart rate. I also mentioned last class, this is what Christopher Reeve damaged when he fell off his horse, was his medulla. Subsequently, he was not able to breathe, swallow, or have a lot of heart, his heart rate had to constantly be monitored. Because of the damage he had there, it was no longer doing it on its own. So he needed a way for this to be done for him. The very bad part for people to injure. The medulla also serves as a sort of switchboard for the senses. When sensory information comes in from the left side of the body, what hemisphere of the brain gets that information? The right side, right? And vice versa. Sensory information that comes in from the right side is moved towards the left hemisphere. That happens at the medulla, right? So it serves as a sort of switchboard for your senses and routes them to the appropriate hemisphere. The pons is a large swelling that sits right above the medulla. Again, it is sort of towards the bottom section of the brain, and it seems to play a role in sleep, dreaming, left-right body coordination, and arousal tendencies. The other thing in the pons is that there are a lot of motor neurons that run out from the brain to other part, your muscles. We'll do that in a second. The reticular formation, again, in that sort of bottom area of the brain, it is simply sections of neurons that runs through the middle of the medulla and the pons, a little slightly above. And it seems to have a very large role in selective attention. So what I mean by selective attention is it draws your attention to changes in the environment. So when the AC unit is on, do you acclimate to the sound of the AC unit? But as soon as it clicks off, do you notice? Right? That is happening here. The mom, right? The mom that has the newborn baby who can sleep through a train running by her house in California, Pennsylvania. But the sound of her baby crying instantly gets her out of bed, right? It happens here. There's some concern that maybe their ADHD is affected in this particular area. If you have this part of your brain damaged, a lot of people fall into a very sleep-like coma, okay? So again, seems to be highly responsive to changes in the environment. Like in when you're driving too, and you don't really remember like ever really driving, right? You've driven to school or driven to work and gotten there and you're like, how'd I get here? Like I don't really even remember the drive here. But when a car in front of you hits their brake lights, what happens? Are you instantly drawn to what's happening, right? All of that is happening here at the reticular formation. It's responsible for a lot of the changes that you encounter in your environment. And in rats, if you stimulate the reticular formation, they will jerk wide awake, right? So when they're stimulated, it causes them to instantly sort of be wide awake. Again, it's all about the sort of attention. Cerebellum sits at the lower part of the brain, behind the pons. It seems to have a large role in a lot of our coordinated involuntary movements, these sort of rapid, fine motor things that we do. Things like walking, skating, dancing, playing a guitar. Movements of speech seem to be housed here in the cerebellum. It's often referred to as like the little brain. So learned skills seem to be stored here. If it's damaged, so somebody who has cerebellum damage, they will move like somebody who's very intoxicated. Right? A lot of their fine motor movement becomes heavily impacted. So how they move seems to be very similar to how somebody who's really intoxicated would move, the difficulties associated with that. So a lot of those fine motor movements go away. All right, so the bottom part of the brain, the cerebellum, often called the little brain because it's a resemblance to the entire brain. The medulla, sits at the bottom of the brain and the top of the brain, or top of the spinal cord. Pons right before it. The reticular formation, reticular activating system, runs right in between them all. Again, the medulla is a part of the brain you do not want to damage. A lot of those life-sustaining functions are heavily impacted by damage there. Yeah?
If, like how you showed us that clip of that girl that had one side of her brain in,
Mm-hmm.
why can your brain reroute that, but not like fine motor skills or things in your cerebellum?
Okay, so what a lot of people think is that the basic idea is that these are very primitive parts of the human brain. And that as you move out, even parts of this as very primitive parts of the human brain. We'll talk here about emotions and stuff housed here. As you go out, it's like greater sort of evolutionary development, right? These sort of essential tasks for your body remain down here. That the more, like the cortex has greater ability in plasticity and taking over the functions rather than these sort of more primitive parts of the brain as being more like damage there. You can't take out half of somebody's medulla and be okay. The tasks here are very specific for what these particular areas do. The further you go out, as we'll talk about, there are a lot of sections that have very specific roles, but the connections that exist between the neurons, I think, allows your brain to have that sort of plasticity in taking over structure and function a little bit if there is damage to certain areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so the middle section that I just mentioned, this area in here, we're talking about the limbic system. The limbic system, several brain structures located right underneath the cortex. The cortex is the outer layer, the part of the brain that people think about when they think about the brain, that sort of wrinkled mass on the outside. The limbic system under the cortex, and it seems to play a heavy role in our ability to learn new information, and to store memories. Emotion, our emotional reaction to information, and motivation. Thalamus, part of the limbic system, it sits right in the center section of our brain. It sort of relays information like a triage nurse. What's a triage nurse do?
They triage patients to like the least severe to the most severe, so the most severe patients get the attention first.
Okay, and to make sure that patients see the appropriate doctor for whatever they need to see, right? Okay, you're right. All right, so the thalamus serves as a sort of triage. As sensory information comes to the brain, it routes that sensory information to the proper areas of the cortex. So that things that are associated with auditory sound are routed to the part of the cortex that deals specifically with your ability to make sense of the sounds that are coming in. The part sensory information that comes in that's associated with visual information. The thalamus will route that information to the appropriate part of the brain that deals with sort of your vision. Make sense? So it takes this sensory information and routes it to very specific areas so that the appropriate part of the brain is getting what it needs. The one sense that is different is the olfactory bulbs. Your sense of smell is not routed in any way. The olfactory bulbs sit right. That information that comes in doesn't need to be transmitted. So when you walk in the bathroom and that smell assaults you as you walk in, it hasn't been routed anywhere. It hits you straight on. You with me? The other senses have to be routed to very specific parts of the brain region. Our sense of smell, though, these olfactory bulbs sit just under the front of the brain, and they receive all of this sort of smell information, smell senses, and that information, that sensory stuff, does not need to be routed. You get that full force without any sort of routing going on there. The hypothalamus, again, part of the limbic system, and it seems to have a very specific role when it comes to dealing with things like motivational behaviors that people engage in. Things like sleep, hunger, thirst, and sex, as well as being located very near to the pituitary gland. We'll talk about the pituitary gland. It's often referred to as the master gland. But the hypothalamus sits very close to that section. And again, seems to be involved in a lot of these motivational types of behaviors that people engage in. hippocampus. We learned a lot about the hippocampus through something very tragic that happened. There was a patient who was simply known as HM. And what happened to HM is he was having some issues. And what they thought was, this is a while ago, right? What they thought was if we could do a brain operation, maybe we can figure out where a lot of these seizure activities are taking place with him. If we can figure out where those seizure activities are taking place, we may be able to help this person. Essentially, they were going to do like a split brain procedure on him, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what they did was they completely destroyed the hippocampus. When HM's hippocampus was completely destroyed, he was never able to form a new memory. Okay, so because of what has happened to him, right, this is a great example of the case study, right? Something incredibly tragic happened to HM, but we learned a lot about the function of that particular area of the brain as a result. So like every time I've taught this class, everybody wants to talk about 50 first dates, right? This is what we're talking about. What happened in that film? All right, Drew Barrymore repeated the same day over and over and over again. This is what happened to HM. He was never able to form a new memory. So every memory he had stopped right then, was up until the point of his injury. So after this injury, never again was he able to form a new memory. Okay? This is incredibly tragic. You get it, right? What they quickly found was that he could learn new things. So if you were to, let's say HM learned how to play tennis. He wasn't able to sort of know that he would play tennis. So if you asked HM, can you play tennis? If he sort of learned after his injury, what is he going to say to you? No, I'm not able to. But if you took HM out on the tennis court, what happened, do you think? He could play. His motor memory was intact. Right? It's the formation and storing of long-term memories that seem to happen right in this specific area. So he recently died, and they wrote a very lengthy book about everything that involved him. It's an incredibly detailed case study about his life and the tragedy that revolved around what happened to him. But from a simple operation, they screwed up, they destroyed the hippocampus, and this guy was never able to form another memory. The amygdala, again, part of the limbic system, it seems to be responsible for a lot of our fear responses and learned memories for why we should be fearful of particular things. Removing the amygdala in monkeys will take away their fear response. So most monkeys, like most people, will show a fear of like snakes, right? If you take it out of monkeys, that fear response goes away. They're not afraid of snakes, and they're not afraid of human beings, right? So very specific functions for these areas of the brain. And here's just a visual area of where the limbic system lies, kind of right in the center of the brain. Again, the thalamus relays a lot of the sensory information, the big red area here. The amygdala sits down here, the hippocampus right along this backside. Again, the hippocampus, destroying that was what led to loss of being able to form new memories in HM. Right, the cortex, the outer part of the brain, that sort of wrinkled area, is densely packed with neurons. A lot is going on at the end of the cortex. This is where a lot of our higher order thought processing is happening. So our ability to sort of think abstractly, to think abstractly about new information that we're receiving, a lot of this is happening here. As sensory information comes in, what happens is the cortex, different parts of the cortex are going to receive it, but that information also has to be interpreted in some level too. What is the information that this part of the brain is receiving? So the cortex is responsible for higher order thought, but also interpreting and making sense of the sensory input that it is given to it. Does that make sense? It's routed to the cortex, but the cortex still has to make sense of the information that it is receiving. You with me? Okay. Corticalization refers to the wrinkling of the cortex. Why do you think this wrinkling is so important?
More surface area.
Okay, what does that mean?
More room to store information.
All right, we can pack it all in, right? If you were to take the cortex and like flatten it out, iron it out, it'd be like 2 to 3 square feet. There's a lot here, but we are able to fit it into in our heads into a pretty small area. because of this corticalization, this wrinkling that takes place in this particular area. And if you look at the human cortex, right, compared to a lot of other animals, we have a lot more going on for us than a lot of other animals, right? Which doesn't surprise you, I'm assuming. Okay, so if you look at the brain, it almost looks like there are two sections to the brain, right? That we have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. We have the right side and the left side. And we have learned a bit about the sort of specialization associated with the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. How are they connected? It's through the corpus callosum, right? It's this thick band of neurons that connects the right and the left hemisphere. That's the only way that these two things are able to communicate with one another. It also means if you split it, what happens? The connection is lost. Your right hemisphere is no longer able to communicate with your left hemisphere, and vice versa. And there have been a lot of instances where they have intentionally severed this in people. People who have sort of life-threatening seizures, they were severing the corpus callosum. And we'll watch a quick video about split brain patients, but they showed some incredible things as a result, and learned, again, a lot about the specialization of the right and left hemisphere as a result of these split brain patients. All right, there are sort of four lobes, so we can think about kind of different sections associated with each of the hemispheres. So kind of divided into four different sections. The occipital lobe sits at the rear and bottom part of each cerebral hemisphere, and this is where the visual centers of the brain sort of are lying. So if you've ever hit the back of your head and reported seeing stars, that sort of thing, you've knocked the occipital lobe area in your particular in your brain. The primary visual cortex is a very specific part on the occipital lobe that processes information that's coming in from the eyes. So again, that information has to be processed and interpreted. It receives it, so it has to be processed, but it does still need to be interpreted. And the visual association cortex is what does that interpretation. So it identifies and makes sense of the visual information. So what do you think happens to somebody who has damage to the visual association area?
Can't see.
They can see things, but they're not able to properly identify what they are.
Yes, they can see things, but they're unable to identify what it is that they're looking at.
So is it like just objects you can't actually see details?
No, you would see the details, but literally being unable to identify it.
Oh.
So you could see your significant other's face, but you would have no idea, like you couldn't identify that information.
Is that kind of like the same thing I heard before about like someone who had like split brain? It was something I learned in high school, and like you can see things and like you know what they are, but you're unable to say what it is. Is that the same thing,
So with split brain,
or is that where the hemispheres are crossing? It's not making that connection.
if you're talking about the split brain, what is happening is one hemisphere, if you flash things on the right side or the left side,
Yeah.
what you flash on the left side is being processed in the right, and what you flash on the right becomes processed in the left. Right? If you do that separately, they will report seeing one thing, and if you ask them to draw what they've seen, they draw something completely different, right? Because what one hemisphere sees, the other one doesn't. So they may say, I saw a baseball, and you ask them to draw it, and they draw a hammer, and they can't tell you why it is that they just did that, right? It's because of what's coming in and the interpretation involved with each of those hemispheres. One hemisphere sees one thing, the other hemisphere sees something else. Crazy, right? All right, so damage here, they still see, but they're unable to make any sort of identification or sense of that particular information. Parietal lobes, section of the hemispheres located at the top and the back, our senses for touch, taste, and temperature are processed here. The somatosensory cortex is this section of neurons. It runs down the front of the parietal lobes, and it's responsible for processing information that comes in from the skin and internal body receptors for touch, so touch experiences, temperature experiences, the position of your body, and possibly taste, all happening in this specific area of neurons called the somatosensory cortex. Our temporal lobes, areas of the cortex right behind the temples. This is the part of your brain that's responsible for hearing and being able to make meaningful speech production. All right, the primary auditory cortex, this processes auditory information that is coming in from the ears. So this is where the information is being processed. The auditory association cortex identifies that particular information, so it's making sense of that auditory information as it comes in. And the frontal lobes, area of the cortex located in the front and top of the brain, this seems to be responsible for a lot of the higher mental processes that we engage in. Our decision-making process seems to be occurring here. A lot of times that part of the brain is called the executive part of the brain, right? That sort of decision-making section of our brain, as well as for the production of fluent speech. So again, when we talked about Phineas Gage, right? Phineas Gage had the tapering iron shot through his face, and it left out the top of his head, right? Incredible that he lived, but a lot of what was going on is he lost his sort of higher mental processing, right? So his change in personality had a lot to do with his sort of executive decision making going out the window. That part of your brain that tells you not to steal that wouldn't be a good idea, right? Disconnected and no longer there for him. The motor cortex is housed in the frontal lobe, and it seems to be responsible for sending motor commands to the muscles of the somatic nervous system. So again, very specific sections of the brain responsible for very specific activities in people. So occipital lobe sits in the back with the visual cortex, the parietal lobe at the top, temporal lobe kind of right behind the temples, and the frontal lobe in the front. The motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex lying here. So very specific areas of the brain, when they become damaged, if doctors know exactly where that brain damage has occurred, they can make a very good prognosis about what is going to be impacted negatively as a result of the specific area of the brain that has been damaged. You with me? So you see these sort of functions that have very specific locations where they're housed in the brain. All right, a little bit about the association areas that are part of the brain. The association areas are sort of devoted to making sense of the sensory information that is coming in from our senses. It seems to be responsible for storing of memory, images, and knowledge, and making sense of a lot of incoming sensory information. Again, the only thing not involved here, though, is what? What type of sense? Smell, right? Smell is housed completely on its own. So the area within each lobe of the cortex that becomes responsible for processing and interpreting very specific information that it received. Broca's area in the left frontal lobe is devoted to the production of speech. So somebody who has damage here is going to have a very difficult time with the production of speech. They may know exactly what it is that they want to say, but they're having a very difficult time producing that. So Broca's aphasia is when that is damaged. So somebody's going to have a very difficult time in being able to speak fluently. So they might speak haltingly, or they might mix incorrect words in with what they're saying, mispronounce words, or speak haltingly. Like the actual production of speech becomes dramatically impacted when that area is impacted. Wernicke's area is left temporal lobe, involved in understanding the meaning of words. Right? So Wernicke's aphasia, having damage in that particular part of your brain, affects a person's ability to understand or produce meaningful language. So they're having a difficult time understanding what it is that somebody is saying to them. But a lot of times, it's meaningful language is going to be difficult for them as well. So they may talk in very nonsensical ways. Again, they may know exactly what it is that they're trying to say, but literally the production of that becomes impacted because of the damage that has occurred. Spatial neglect is this really interesting phenomenon that occurs when somebody has some of the damage in these association areas. The right hemisphere, when it's damaged, people will have this inability to recognize objects that exist in the left visual field. So if you show somebody like a clock, right? This kind of came in blurry. If you show them a clock and ask them to draw the clock, they're going to leave out this section. Why? Because they're literally not seeing it. Right? Some of the things that people talk about is makeup not being on one side of a woman's face. She's just putting it on one side of her face. Spatial neglect, she's literally not seeing that part of her visual field. Drawing the flower, they draw half the flower. Drawing a house, they draw, half the house or portion of the house. They're literally not processing that information that's coming in from the left side.
But since they can't see it, don't they feel it? Like if she's putting on makeup, wouldn't she feel the other side of her face?
Just doing it by visual. A lot of people are just going to simply put it on. I see what you're saying. Like, why
Yeah,
doesn't she
like-
just feel it? She doesn't see it.
Okay.
So how would she be able to?
Okay.
It'd be really difficult. Yeah.
Like, can't they also just look at it like with their other eye?
Turn.
Like,
I mean,
why is it like they can't see that part? Like I thought just like one side is damaged, they can't really.
turn their head to look at it.
Yeah, look at it like through the other eye.
That's. Yes. Like one of the things would be right, but here, typically what they would do here is show somebody,
Okay.
like one side of this eye is receiving part of it, and this eye is receiving the other part, so they're not processing all that information that's coming in. Does that make sense?
Okay.
But typically, one of the things that they would do is, teach people to sort of turn like that. The other thing is, I'll show you in a second, but parts of your eye are involved in like, all of the left side isn't processed just in your left eye, and all of the right side isn't just processed, it happens,
Yeah, that's why I was kinda like, why can't they, it's not like they can't see it, they just can't like
Okay, that information you're right. The sensory information may be coming in, but what's happening is their ability to actually process the information. If they're not processing it, no interpretation is going to happen, right? So where the damage lies is in the processing of that information. Is that good?
Yeah.
That makes sense? Okay. All right, so split brain patients, right? You'll see this incredible stuff that's being done with these split brain patients, where they are literally severing the corpus callosum. So the two hemispheres are no longer able to communicate with one another. So essentially, people have two independent brains. What's happening in the right hemisphere is not crossing over into the left hemisphere. Again, it's typically done when people have severe muscle spasms associated with epilepsy, where there's electrical activity that's in one hemisphere that's impacting negatively things going on in the other hemisphere. So the way that they have dealt with this is to sever the corpus callosum, right? So you end up with these patients who have essentially two independently working brains here. It's kind of an old clip, but it'll give you an idea of some of the work that they've done with these particular patients.
Right hemisphere now are working independent of each other, but
So this is a split brain
you don't
patient.
notice it. Now you just kind of adapt to it. It doesn't. You don't have any feeling. It doesn't feel any different than it did before.
7 years ago, Joe had brain surgery to allay the effects of severe epilepsy. His surgeon cut the nerve fibers connecting his left hemisphere with his right. While the operation was a complete success, Joe's unusual case offers an extraordinary insight into the machinery of mind. This fiber system, the corpus callosum, is located midway between the two hemispheres. When it was surgically severed in Joe's brain, the transmission of information between the two hemispheres was halted. Michael Gazanica.
What we can do is play tricks by putting information into his disconnected, mute, non-talking right hemisphere and watch it produce behaviors. And out of that, we can really see that there is, in fact, a reason to believe that there's all kinds of complex processes going on outside of his conscious awareness of his left half brain. Joe, I'm going to show you some things. I just want you to tell me what you see. And here we go. You ready? Look right at the dot.
So he's looking at a dot, and they'll flash things on either side.
Cut.
Right. Okay, you ready? Look right at the dot.
Grapes.
Good.
So he
When
sees it
Joe
on the right.
focuses on a point, right at the dot, everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech. Right at the dot. So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture, Joe is easily able to name it. close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work here. Okay, what do you got there?
Can.
Okay, very good.
All right, so quickly, I'll restart it. But what just happened? Okay, so when it's flashed on the right side, it goes to the left hemisphere, right? Speech and language housed predominantly in the left hemisphere. When it's flashed on the left, it's going to what hemisphere? The right. More what I refer to as a more dormant hemisphere. So when asked to indicate what he just saw on the left side, is he able to do it? But he closes his eyes and he draws with his left. Why does he draw with his left?
Because it's from the right hemisphere.
It's coming from the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere did see what was in the left visual field, yes? But he is unable to sort of verbalize it. But his hand is able to draw it because the part of his brain that processed that information still saw it. You with me? Kind of?
Now, when a
But
Yeah.
he was still able to say what it was.
After he drew it.
Oh, so if he wouldn't have drawn it, he wouldn't have been able to say what it was?
He wasn't able to say what it was. He said, "What did you see?" And he said, "I didn't see it." He then tells him to close his eyes, use his left hand, and draw what he saw, and is able to do it with his left hand.
word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain. Who'd you draw?
Okay.
What'd you see?
Wheel, one side, and on the other side.
So even though he can't name it, his left hand is able to draw out the picture of the stimulus of the picture or word to be presented to his right half brain. What did you see? So just close your eyes and draw with your left hand. Just let it go. That's nice. What's that?
Saw.
What'd you see? Hammer. What'd you draw that for?
I don't know.
What we
That
have
would be
Joe
so
is just a dramatic example of a neurologic case that really allows you this window into the non-conscious and how powerful non-conscious processes are at influencing our conscious self, our personal self. What Joe and patients like him, and there are many of them, teaches us is that the mind is made up of a constellation of independent, semi-independent agents, and that these agents, these processes can carry on a vast number of activities outside of our conscious awareness. Even though that goes on, there's some final stage or some final system, which I happen to think is in the left hemisphere, that pulls all of this information together into a theory. It has to generate a theory to explain all of these independent elements. And so, and that theory becomes our particular theory of ourself and of the world.
All right. So each of the hemispheres is sort of acting independently in this situation with no communication between the two. So what is processed in the left hemisphere then is completely different from what is processed in the right hemisphere. And without that connection between the two hemispheres, their ability to communicate with one another is gone. You getting the picture? All right. So split brain research. They study these patients in great detail because of this procedure they've received, right? So essentially, they are sending messages to only one of the hemispheres. They're not getting this communication between the total whole. If you've ever heard the phrase your right brain or your left brain, we use these sort of in a sort of lay fashion, but it's really incorrect because a lot of what happens with the whole, okay? But through some of the split brain work that they've done, they've been able to figure out what is going on with a lot of the right and left specializations with our hemispheres. That there are some specializations housed in the left hemisphere, and there are some specializations that are housed in the right hemisphere. So what you're seeing here right, is how we process information. And this is what I was was mentioning a little bit earlier. What happens in the right visual field becomes processed through the right eye, but it also becomes processed through the left eye. Okay? It's routed to the left hemisphere. Both eyes play a role in what is going on here. And same with the left eye. It processes information in the left hemisphere, but so does the right eye. And again, it's processed to the right hemisphere. So in what you just saw, if you flashed a ball and a hammer here simultaneously, what is this person going to indicate they saw? The ball, right? They will say what was seen by the left hemisphere. But what are they going to draw with their left hand? The hammer. Because that is what was processed in the right hemisphere. Crazy? Pretty wild stuff, right? Yeah.
Does that mean they could draw a ball if they wanted to, or would they not be able to since what they saw basically in their head was the hammer?
They could draw a ball, but they could draw it with what hand? The right hand. The left hemisphere controls the right hand. That's the whole connection of why he was having that guy use his left hand, right? This is what that guy was referring to as the dormant hemisphere. When it comes to processing a lot of visual stuff, that specialization is housed here. Crazy stuff, right? All right. All as a result of this severing here of the corpus callosum.
Would you have almost been able to imagine the one thing in his head like he was drawing it and then be able to say it? Or would you have to use some kind of motor?
He was having to use the motor.
He wouldn't be able to
He wasn't able to produce the speech.
So it's just completely.
And when asked why he drew that, and you guys laughed, and he said, I don't know. Right? Because he's not consciously aware of what's going on. And I have a little bit of issue with his use of the unconscious, but that researcher was using unconscious here because what he's saying is this processing of, in this example, the hammer is outside of this individual's conscious awareness. Because what they are focused on is what would have been processed by the left hemisphere. Right? Crazy stuff, right? Split brain, right? But it has taught us a lot about what is going on with specialization in the hemisphere. So what we found is that the left side of the brain seems to control language. It plays a heavy role in writing. The logical thought that we engage in, our analysis, mathematical abilities seem to be housed predominantly in the left side of the brain. It processes information sequentially. If this, then this, then this, then this. It plays a large role in speaking, right? We can speak because a lot of what happens in the left side of the hemisphere. Okay, so the right side of the brain seems to play a role in emotional expression, spatial perception, recognition of faces and patterns and melodies and emotions all seem to be housed in the right hemisphere. And as the left processes things sequentially, what we see is the right hemisphere processes information globally. Remember we talked about Gestalt, processing the whole? That's more about what the right side of the brain does. And it cannot speak. So again, when we see these incidents happen, we've learned a lot of information from these split brain patients. And a lot of what we've learned about the specialization of the hemispheres has come around as a result of these particular patients. So again, yeah?
So when somebody's like bad at math, people usually are like, oh yeah, you think with like whatever side of your brain that doesn't use math. Is that true, or is it just like?
It probably means you've had some bad math teachers.
Okay, so it doesn't have anything. You don't really think more with one side of your brain if you're good at something.
Not necessarily.
Mine was kind of like the same example, except for I was using more the creative side. I knew
Oh, you're a right-brained person, right? That's what people say.
Yeah, like say for example, if you're left-handed, most people say, oh, well, your right side of your brain's stronger then, because that handles creativity. I just wasn't sure if that was true or not.
No.
Is that why most people are right-handed, since the left side of your brain?
Actually, there's a lot of different theories for why we see right versus left-handedness, and why they're like one is more dominant. I don't know which theory actually is like supported more in the evidence, but there's all these different theories as to why. Right? I don't know if they've come up with a good reason why we see it predominantly, as why most people are right-handed. Yeah. Anything else? All right, so in the left hemisphere, this is what happens. It controls the right hand. It's responsible for a lot of the spoken language that we engage in. Our ability to write language is largely found in the left hemisphere. Our mathematical calculations, our logical thought processing that we do, our analysis to detail, reading, strongly related to activity that takes place in the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere controls our left hand, plays a role in a lot of nonverbal processing, our visual spatial perception patterns, our music and artistic processing, emotional thought and recognition, our processing the whole of things, pattern recognition, and facial recognition all seem to be predominantly processed by the right hemisphere. Again, a lot of what happens though, we need the connection here for everything, right? They process these things, there is specialization, but the brain as a whole kind of puts it all together, right? As we saw, if you split it, you see some effects of not processing everything or not being able to understand everything. Questions on split brain? Crazy stuff, right? All right. The last section that we'll talk about are the hold on, I think I had one more thing I was going to talk about. If we have time, I'll go to it. Okay, the endocrine gland. So back to sort of what's happening with a lot of the chemical connections here. The endocrine glands are glands that secrete chemicals, what we call hormones, directly into our bloodstreams. So hormones are these chemicals when they become released into our bloodstream, cause a whole different range of things for us. They do a wide range of activities. So our pituitary gland is often referred to as the master gland. It is located in the brain and it secretes the human growth hormone. It influences all other hormone secreting glands. Pineal gland is the endocrine gland near the base of the cerebrum. Secretes melatonin. What does melatonin do for you? Yeah. Makes you sleepy. So if you've ever traveled internationally, like drastic time changes, like if you've ever gone to India or anything like that, somebody may have told you to take melatonin, right? So it's easier to adjust to what's going on, right? To try and help avoid jet lag. So when light is sort of diminished, there's less light coming in, our brain starts to produce melatonin. As light is coming in the morning, it stops producing melatonin, right? So melatonin pills are a way to help people who have sleep issues. My mom, a long time ago, I don't sleep well at night. I never have slept well. I slept like 4 hours last night. Sucks. It sucks. My wife is out like in 30 seconds. I'm talking to her and she's asleep. Let me tell you, if you're somebody who doesn't sleep well, and you sleep next to a person that's like that, you're like, but my mom gave me this alarm clock. It's supposed to be like this natural alarm clock to wake you up. I used it for like 2 days. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. Then it's just light, right? So 30 minutes before your alarm goes off, it glows brighter and brighter and brighter, right? And the whole idea, I mean, it plays into this like melatonin issue, right? So as you're sleeping, it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. You produce less melatonin. You're supposed to awake more naturally so that when the alarm goes off, you're no longer in this deep stage of sleep. You're already on the verge of waking up. It just was annoying because I like missed out on 30 minutes of sleep. You know, like, because I woke up instantly and I'm like, damn, I don't need to get up at 5:30. I need to get up at 6. All right, so I guess it's effective, right? All right, so the production of melatonin that helps us sleep. Thyroid gland found in the neck, and it helps regulate our metabolism level. What's metabolism?
How fast your body, I lost the word.
How fast your body what?
Like burns food.
All right. Let's just stick with calories to make it easy, right? How fast their body consumes calories and stuff like this. All right. So people who have damage to this particular gland in the thyroid may have difficulty breaking down the food that they take in, right? No matter what, they seem to maybe gain weight or something like this. That's where damage to the thyroid gland can cause. Pancreas, endocrine gland, it controls the levels of sugar in our blood. When our body produces too little insulin, what happens? Diabetes, right? And if your body produces too much insulin, what is it? Yeah, hyperglycemia. And individuals who produce too much, they feel hungry all the time, right? So it may be when your body produces too much insulin, it can be associated with being overweight because they feel hungry all the time. Gonads, sex glands secrete hormones that regulate sexual development and behavior, as well as reproduction. For women, it's the ovaries. Obviously, for men, it's the testes. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys, and they secrete over 30 different types of hormones. And these different hormones deal with a wide range of things. They deal with stress. They can help regulate salt intake for people, and they provide a secondary source of sex hormones affecting sexual changes that occur in people during adolescence. Right? Hormones.